Buongiorno, bentrovati. Distinguished senators, dear Secretary General, dear guests and colleagues, it is my great pleasure to welcome in the Senate the President of the Nationale Normenkontrollrat, Mr. Johannes Ludewig, in the 10th year since the establishment of such prestigious institution in the Federal Republic of Germany. Last March, a delegation from the Italian Senate was hosted in Berlin. The visit was aimed to deepen the knowledge of the methodologies for assessing the costs imposed by legislation on citizens, business, and administration. The working methods developed and implemented so far by the Nationale Normenkontrollrat are indeed highly regarded on both a national and international level. Ensuring transparency of compliance costs is intended to make the policymakers in government and parliament aware of the financial consequences before they make a decision. The assessment of the compliance costs prior to the adoption of legislation ex ante procedure has been more recently complemented by an ex post procedure for checking at regular intervals how laws and regulation have stood the test of practical application and implementation too. Those actions are of the utmost importance for improving the decision-making process and the quality of legislations in terms of adequacy and effectiveness. A parliament focusing mainly, if not solely, on passing laws is a notion as obsolete in Italy and Europe and as it is elsewhere in the world. Improving the quality of legislation requires identification of the causal links, or more precisely, of the correlation between a law and the achievement of the changes pursued by the lawmaker. In order to assessing whether a particular law is the appropriate means to meet the lawmaker's goal, various models are to be found. In the British and American systems, both government and parliament focus mainly on how a regulation produces changes in the society. The European continental, particularly German system, gives priority to the federal government's analysis of the cost of legislation and how it affects the fiscal situation of the state, the enterprises, and consumers. The French continental tradition focuses instead on how the outcome of legislation meets expectations, an analysis which is usually performed by Parliament. In Italy, we only have two instruments which are comparable to the methods of assessment and evaluation described so far. AIR, assessment of the impact of regulation, and VIR, evaluation of the impact of regulation, which are both performed by the government, respectively ex ante and ex post. In both cases, formal, or so to say legal criteria are used, with little substantive and economic input. Scholars, however, have been studying best practices in Europe and elsewhere for over 15 years, and methods have been developed based on empirical and factual evidence and on the search for causality, in some cases by implementing experimental methods. These important results now represent a challenge for the Italian Senate staff. The administration has started networking with research centers in Italy and abroad to provide ex ante and ex post studies on major legislative proposals. The Senate is fully aware of the importance of tools to assess and evaluate public policies, as long as they do not make the bureaucracy of decision-making more cumbersome, thereby delaying the passage of laws. However, for the legislator to benefit from a preventive assessment of individual proposals for legislation. Priority should be given to a few specific sectors selected according to criteria as objective as possible. According to the Constitutional Reform Bill, which was approved last April and will be submitted to a referendum in October, the Senate of the Republic shall act as a link between the state, the other constituent elements of the Republic, and the European Union. It shall take part in decisions relating to the development and enforcement of EU policies and regulatory measures. It shall evaluate public policies and the activities of public administrations and the impact of EU policies at the local level. The functions of the new Senate are thus mainly related to three areas, namely representing local authorities, participation in the European integration process, and public policy evaluation. In order to ensure a qualified administrative support to the new Senate, at the present stage there is a strong focus on public policy evaluation, which is a completely new competence. The only other constitution which lays down such a competence for national parliament is the French Constitution. However, the approach we plan to adopt is a different one. Our work will put a stronger emphasis on impact assessment ex ante as well as ex post, and an increased focus on implementation. To this end, we will use different tools for evaluating and reporting the effectiveness and coherence of proposed legislation for assessing whether measures have the foreseen impact. Best practices and methods have been developed in Europe and elsewhere for the past 15 years and more, based on empirical and factual evidence and on the search for causality, in some cases by implementing experimental methods too. These important results now represent a challenge for Italian Senate staff. Assessment and evaluation will not focus on an individual measure, but on public policies, the overall lines of action, the strategic and comprehensive approach of public governance as a whole. To this end, both quantitative and qualitative methods will be used. Qualitative methods are going to be used for understanding contexts and for measuring levels and changes in impacts, while quantitative methods will help establish the causality of the impact of specific public policies on project outcomes and can be used to test hypotheses. In this framework, cooperation with other European institutions is essential. From our point of view, this represents a significant opportunity for sharing experience on the methodology and the results which can be achieved at the national as well as at the European level through impact assessment of legislation and public policies. It also allows for the further development of the significant synergies for parliamentary scrutiny and oversight and for evaluation of EU legislation and policies. The administration of the Italian Senate intends to strengthen knowledge sharing among administrations for the purpose of improving the quality of legislation. We will be glad to cooperate with the National Normenkontrollrat in order to achieve this common aim. I'm now pleased to give the floor to President Ludewig, thanking him once again for being here today, and thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, buongiorno. I'm sorry that my Italian stops here, so I have to continue in English. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I think my colleagues in the Normenkontrollrat and myself, we feel very honored, I think, that we have started this exchange, that we could receive you and your delegation in Berlin to start, I think, the discussion on the issues I think you have outlined here. and that we can continue this dialogue in a certain sense now today. So my idea is, as we discussed that, is I will give you a short overview on what we are doing, and then you simply start asking me to clarify all the questions which are certainly not, which are certainly still open. And what I should add is maybe before I start is that I have worked for a long time as an active civil servant in the government. So in the Chancellery, I was the responsible Director General on Economic and Finance, and in this capacity, the advisor to Chancellor Kohl in the 1990s, and later on State Secretary, Ministry of Economics. Then later I left the government and was CEO of the German Railways, and later on of the European Railway Association. So, and then all of a sudden the government showed up and asked me, can you take over this job, which I have now, and it turned out really being very interesting for me, because in the time when I was in the government, all this didn't exist. So I can a little bit compare, and sometimes I'm surprised myself that when the time when I was in the government, nobody asked on the consequences of all these wonderful legislation which were adopted, prepared in the government, then adopted by Parliament. So. I've prepared a couple of slides, and we simply go through that, and then you will certainly have a lot of questions. So here on the first one, I'm showing you, not that you see all the wonderful people, I think, in person who are working with me in the Normenkontrollrat, but a little bit to start, we are an independent body, and our office, we are organizationally linked to the Federal Chancellery. And our mandate is 5 years. This both was done having the office in the Chancellery, being independent, but nevertheless you need an office, and the office is in the Chancellery. The idea behind that was to underline the importance of the Commission. So not assigning that to a ministry, but saying, okay, it's assigned to the Chancellor's office. So that is more a question of prestige or something, and of course very important. And also the term, the length of the term is 5 years. That was done by intention, because the term of Parliament and government in a way is 4 years. And in order to underline the independence, one decided, I think, to have a 5 years term. So you can see 2016 in September, our second term is over. We will have a big event in Berlin with the Chancellor and also the Vice Chancellor to come together to review what has happened, what did we learn, and then the government will appoint a new team, or maybe the same team, we don't know yet, for the third term, because the procedure is the government makes proposals for the members of this body, and the President of the Republic appoints the member. And then there's one special, the chairman of the committee is directly appointed by the Chancellor. So that is how it works. And I have done that a little bit more in detail on the next page, not because the names are so important, but that you can, if you're interested, you can look into this later on, and then you can see the professional background. And then you see there's a broad range, people like myself who have worked in the government and also in business, and others who have been former member of parliaments, others who are, for example, here a lady who was Lord Mayor of one of the bigger German cities. So we have also people who have practical experience from the local level, and also from business. So just whenever if you're interested, you can see that more. Indeed, it's really a broad range of experience, and that is very helpful in discussing all kinds of proposals, because you get proposals from the whole range of ministries, and so you need a certain expertise. What we are usually doing, we have a rapporteur system. So that means we have a member is usually responsible for a certain ministry. So when a proposal is coming, this member who is in charge, I think, will take care of that, together with also somebody in our secretariat who is specialized on that. We have a secretariat altogether, 15 people, including secretaries. And so that is a little bit the practical side of the resources, I think, we have for our work. So this gives an overview of what we are actually doing. What was already what you mentioned, the Chairman, is already the ex-ante assessment or account of compliance costs. So whenever a new legislation proposal is coming from a ministry, then the ministry has to do the calculation of the compliance costs expected, and then we are checking whether the calculation is plausible and whether the methodology, I think, was really respected, so that not everybody can start calculating something. He must follow certain rules, so that then at the end the figures, the cost figures are comparable, from one piece of legislation to the next one. So therefore you need a certain methodology. So I come back to that in a minute. Then we are looking forward whenever new proposals are coming, and the second you see is a logical consequence, and that is looking. Once a legislation has been adopted and is implemented, that you are looking 3 or 5 years, as we are doing that in Germany, later, what has actually happened. And I mean, it's something, in my view, which is self-explicit, but I'm surprised myself that at least in the German history of legislation, which is 150 or whatever you want years, nobody ever did that in a systematic way. There have always been ex post evaluations in certain cases, but there has never been a systematic approach in this respect. And therefore it's a kind of a small revolution in our system that we are saying now as a rule, which it was a proposal coming from our commission. We discussed that with the Committee of State Secretaries, and at the end we reached agreement saying every piece of legislation going along with, in the ex-ante assessment, with costs of more than 1 million euros, has to be evaluated ex post after 3, 4 or 5 years. So that is the rule now. And as I said, it's a revolution. The decision was taken 3 years ago, so you can imagine now 3 years are over. We will have in the second half of this year the first ex post evaluations, which we then have to look into and to analyze and to see whether the ministries or whoever that is doing it in a way that it really makes sense. The third point, I will come back in a minute then to each one of this, just to give you an overview. The third point is that what we call one in, one out rule. So this is a rule we have seen being used in the United Kingdom, saying that if a minister makes a proposal for new legislation, let's say, for example, going along with costs of 50 million euros, he must make within a year a proposal on something else in his area of competence to reduce costs by 50 million. So the idea is to limit, I think, the increase of costs to business. So the rule one in, one out applies only to business. And that is very important. The idea is, you will see in a minute, the curve is going upward, and the idea was we have to limit that and to put pressure, I think, on the ministries to reflect very carefully before presenting a proposal producing additional costs. And this is, I think, very helpful. There is, of course, an escape clause, so if a minister really can demonstrate that he cannot do that, because there is nothing he can really do, even if he would like to do that, there are certain mechanisms, but no minister has ever used it up to now. And because it's a very difficult procedure, and the minister cannot take the decision himself, he must demonstrate to the Committee of State Secretaries that he is not able to do anything in this respect. And no minister likes, I think, then to go to somebody else and to explain to him and to justify, And so, therefore, up to now, this exemption rule has not been used. Very important is maybe for you also, for your work, the fourth point, what we call a ex-ante procedure for proposals coming from the European Commission. Because our experience is that looking on business in Germany, more than 50% of costs caused by legislation is not coming from decisions in Berlin, but it's coming from decisions in Brussels. And therefore, our idea was, our feeling, it's a little bit strange if we only look into German legislation. We should also look into proposals coming from the Commission. And whenever there are substantial costs, we should request from the ministries that they analyze in detail what do these proposals mean for Germany. what do the proposals presented by the Commission mean to German citizens, to German business, and to the German administration? So this is something I come back to that also in a minute. The next point might also be interesting, I think, to you, what we call life situations of citizens and enterprise and companies. The idea is we are always used to look on specific pieces of legislation, and we ask ourselves, okay, what is the consequence in terms of costs? The citizens and the business people usually do not look so much on specific pieces or proposal legislation. They look on certain situations. I will explain that to you. For example, the situation, what kind of administrative rules apply if you want to set up a new company? Okay, this is for many people, startup companies and so on, an important point. And a lot of rules apply. And is that looking altogether now into such a specific situation, does it make sense? Is it too much? Or do we have to do something? So not starting from the difference is we do not start in this case from one piece of legislation. We start from a certain situation in which business or citizens might find themselves. Or for example, if you become parents, if a child is born, yeah, what kind of things are happening in terms of administrative, and what kind of laws do you have to respect and so on. So that is a little bit, I think, an overview, and I think on what we are working on. So here a little bit an overview how the process actually works. You can see on the left, I have here a wonderful pointer. We can also do that here. Here on the left, you see here a draft proposal is coming from the ministry, and in preparing that, you see here advice. The ministry or the civil servants working on this, they can ask our people here our collaborators, people in the secretariat or members of our commission. They can ask for advice if they want. There's no obligation. So we are doing that. Sometimes ministries are coming very early and saying, okay, we have certain ideas. How do you see that and so on. So, but that is not obligatory, but it happens from time to time. So then, sorry, that was one backward. Yeah. So now a ministry presents a proposal, and before going to cabinet, they must coordinate and discuss it with all the other ministries. And that is exactly the moment when they have, I think, to get our commission involved. So they must present the draft proposal and an impact assessment, explaining in detail the costs. I think the cost assessment, as they see that. So, and then they send it to us, and we analyze that, we check that, and as I said, we are checking, is it the right methodology? Did they also look into cheaper alternatives? Yeah, and did they do the other calculation? Is that really plausible what they present? And then we give a written opinion, and this opinion here is then going to the ministry, and together with the proposal from the ministry is going to cabinet. So every minister, I think, coming to cabinet, taking a decision, is aware what is the opinion of the Normenkontrollrat on this proposal. And then, what is not really outlined here is whenever then the cabinet has taken a decision, the opinion of the Normenkontrollrat is attached to the law, and both the decision of the cabinet and our opinion are sent to Parliament. So, and when it arrives here, it becomes public. So that at the end, the opinion from which we are sending to the government becomes also public. So what happens in Parliament, it's probably the same what happens in your Parliament here. And there's a possibility, as it is said here, advice and assessment on demand. So committees in Parliament can ask, I think, the Normenkontrollrat to come and to join the discussion and to give, I think, their own view on specific pieces of legislation. As you can imagine, this happens usually whenever the piece of legislation is very controversial, particularly in terms of costs. And I can show you in a minute a good example, I think, for this. So then after a certain time, decisions are taken, the proposal enters into force. And then it's very important, but you can see 2 years after, there will be a follow-up measurement of the Federal Statistical Office. So the cost assessment in the beginning is then reviewed 2 years later to see what has actually happened in practice. And that is done not by the of course, the Statistical Office is also part of the government, but it is nevertheless not the government directly. They have a very high reputation, the Federal Statistical Office, so they do that in their own competence. And so they are then sending that to Parliament and to government. And then on this basis, as I said already before, after 3 to 5 years, that depends on the substance of the law, after entering into force, the evaluation is done. And of course, then the idea, therefore, you have here the line going back to proposal. If the result of the evaluation is that expectations have not been fulfilled, or there have been other developments than expected, then of course this would be a basis to revise, I think, the legislation. So therefore, I think we are talking here about a circle, I think, and the principal idea is in the future not to start new legislation if you are changing something before evaluating, I think, what has happened in the last years. That is a little bit the idea. So a short look on maybe the definition. We are always talking about the follow-up cost. We call that also compliance cost. And the definition of compliance cost is, I've quoted that here, compliance costs include the total measurable time expenditure and the costs incurred by citizens, business, and public authorities in order to comply with federal legislation. That is the definition you find also in the law. And so we are not dealing with the budget. That is very important, I think, to keep in mind. The budget is something the finance minister takes care, and the court of auditors. So that is. But we are dealing with the costs imposed not on the budget, but imposed on citizens, business, and the administration. So that is the idea. We have also given here an example, just if, for example, legislation can ask, that there is protective equipment, for example, in industry, noise protection, earphones, or things like this. These are typical costs, I think, then imposed on business. If there is legislation say you have to provide equipment for the workers in your company, then of course these are costs imposed on business, and they have to be taken into account in the context of these cost assessments. So next one, yeah. So we are doing these cost ex ante cost assessments, as you can see here, since the middle of 2011. And what you see here is the curve, accumulative costs, I think, of all the cost assessments or impact assessments we have seen in the last years. And what you can see, what is interesting, is that the curve this is not a steady upward development, but that the cost, whenever the curve is going upward, it's usually linked to specific proposals of legislation. Individual proposals are driving the costs. That is what you can see. Therefore, we have seen here, I've written here also on the curve what have been then the pieces of legislation driving, I think, the cost. For example, here you can see this year a jump of the cost about 2 billion euros, and the reason was the government and Parliament has adopted an energy saving regulation. So saying, for example, all new buildings, whether they are private or business buildings, have to fulfill new, better energy saving standards. And of course, the consequence is that buildings are getting more expensive. So, and this was assessed according to certain coordinators, and you can see here the difference is 2 billion. So the most important one, everybody sees it right away. We had an interesting discussion in Germany. In the past, we never had minimum wages in Germany. We had at least not minimum wages by law. They have always been, this was always a discussion between the social partners, but not, I think, by politics. And for a number of reasons, the trade unions and the government changed their mind, so they wanted to have a law, I think, identifying the minimum wage. And so this was, as you can imagine, a very controversial discussion because we had to tell the ministry, okay, if you are doing that, you have to assess to what extent the costs, labor costs to business will increase. Because, of course, there's a certain number of people, there's €8.50, and when this was discussed, there were a certain number of people earning less than €8.50 per hour. So, and there are certain statistics you can, and research done, and so the overall costs were then determined to be €9.5 billion to business. And this, of course, you can see here the big jump in the curve upward. And then I don't want to go on. There are also cases, of course, to reduce costs. For example, here, electronic or e-procurement act. So that was the idea. All the public procurement had to be done electronic way. So you could not by paper as in the past. You know, everybody had to do that on an electronic way, and there was a cost saving, I think, of more than between, I think, about €1.5 billion. You know? So there are also steps in the positive direction, not only going in upward. You know? So gives you a little bit an overview what has happened in Germany in this respect in the last since the middle of 2011. So next one. Ex post evaluation. So we have discussed it already a little bit, so I don't want to be too long. It's clear, as I said already, this has to be applied to all legislation, all individual proposals for legislation going along with costs of more than €1 million. And the idea is to ensure that regulations are indeed, in reality, achieving their purpose and avoiding unintentional impacts. So there are 5 phases in the process. The first one starts already when new legislation is adopted, because you need here, when you are planning new legislation, a clear definition of what is really the objective of the law. And probably in Italy everything is much better, but in Germany we have found a tremendous number of laws being adopted in the last years, you know, where the objective is rather unclear. Somebody had to go down, but it is not clearly stated in the law what really should be achieved. And this is something now we are discussing very intensively with our ministries, that whenever they make proposals, there must be a clear definition what is the objective of this legislation. And this was not really done in the past. So the second, so you see, to be able to have a good ex post evaluation later on, you have to start when you are doing new legislation, and to prepare that in the correct way. Second point is data collection. So you must, in preparing a new law, the ministry must have a clear idea, how do we collect the necessary data, that after 3 or 5 years we can really have a clear idea, did we achieve our objective, yes or no? And usually you need data for this. And the data, you should not start collecting data after 5 years, but in parallel, I think, to the implementation process. So, point number 3, it's clear you need an analysis of all kinds of impacts, and then a report must be presented on the evaluation. And the 5th point is extremely important, the quality management by an independent third party, because the risk is if the ministry is doing that alone, the ministry, of course, is not neutral, because they want to show, yes, we were wonderful 5 years ago, we had only good ideas, you know, and the result is absolutely perfect or more than 100%, you know. This is normal and human, and therefore you need a neutral party, I think, who is then, before finalizing the report, looking on the report. And the ministry are still free. They can choose a neutral research institute. They can ask also the Normenkontrollrat or whatever, you know. But somebody who is neutral must have a look on this. Otherwise, I think ex post evaluation, I think, does not make very much sense. So this is the basic idea how it should be done. Next point is what I mentioned shortly. Our inquiry in situations of situations in life. So what I just said, you see, the idea was, as I said, that people usually they do not look on individual pieces of legislation. How do they really have an impact on their life? You know, they look on certain situations. So and they have here, as I said, here the Federal Statistical Office, they actually did that, and they're following a certain methodology. They chose certain specific situations. For example, professional trainings or studies. For example, as a student, when you apply for a scholarship, a state scholarship, how is that really working? And is it a bureaucratic procedure? Is it done electronically? Do you still have to do that by paper or not? And how much time does it take? So you look on a situation as a whole, and then you ask yourself, are all the legal background, the legal framework, I think, for this, has to be changed or not? Do the implementation, is it done in a rational way, or do you have the feeling that this doesn't make sense? For example, in Germany, we had the situation talking about scholarships to students, state scholarships. There is one federal legislation on this, but as we have also, as you have regions, we have our also regions, or Länder, as we call that, And usually in Germany, the regions or the Länder and the communities have the competence to implement legislation. So, and our regions had the wonderful idea, okay, we have one legislation, but every region invented a separate system, how now to implement that. So we ended up with 10 different systems all over Germany, and the poor students going from University of Hamburg to University of Munich, all of a sudden the system was totally different. Okay, that doesn't make very much sense. And therefore, we analyzed that and made proposals how we can harmonize that so that the whole procedure, the practical, I think, handling of these authorization process for scholarships, I think, is really done in a reasonable way with a minimum of bureaucracy. In particular, it has to be done in an electronic way. Because the young generation students, they know how to do that. You don't have to explain that to them. So this is just a practical, I think, example. And the same we did also 10 specific situations of business. For example, regarding education and training, we have these apprenticeship system in Germany. There are certain legal requirements, and do they really make sense or not? And can they be adjusted? Are they too bureaucratic or not? Yeah. On the job safety questions, construction of business premises or setting up of as I said already, of a new company. And and the basis for this was information gathered by about interviews with 7,000 citizens and 1,700 businesses in order to have a certain representative overview, really how do people see the legal framework in these specific situations. So what are the interesting results of this survey? We found that also, we never did that in Germany before, at least not on a federal level with so many interviews. And on the positive side was very interesting that people, that was the same citizens and businesses. On the positive side, there was a 90%, I think, feedback saying, okay, we are satisfied with the fact that in Germany we do not see any discrimination in being in contact with public authorities or public administration. There's no corruption. We think corruption is important, and in our practical experience as businesses, we did not encounter corruption. And the third point, which was positive, was they appreciated, not in every case, but I think in general, the expertise, the knowledge of the staff in the administration. So that was a positive side. Then on the negative side, you see, they were not really very happy with the comprehensibility of legislation, with the legal text. And also, most people, citizens as well as businesses, they're very much dissatisfied with the quality and comprehensibility of the forms, the formulas. That is really the interface between administration and business, administration and citizens. And I don't know how that is in Italy, but in Germany, the whole German government system and legal system is, of course, very much, influenced by people who have a law background, who are lawyers. And you can see that from here, because from a lawyer's point of view, all the text of our legislation is wonderful, but nobody understands it. So, and as we are in principle a democracy and the parliament is working for citizens and businesses, it should be, I think, interesting to ask yourself, is anybody there apart from lawyers who can understand, I think, what we just adopted, you know? And the formulas we are developing on that. And in a decentralized country, you also have regions. Do we need different formulas in every region, I think, now to implement this, you know? So in this respect, there was a lot of dissatisfaction. But of course, what I did not expect, but what was very interesting to see, that people's and business conclusion is that in the German administrative system, corruption does not exist, and also there is no discrimination. So that was very clear statements, and we ourselves were very much surprised to have these clear statements, which were, of course, encouraging. So, next point, I mentioned that already, the one-in, one-out rule. As I said, the idea is that, if here, as an example, if a ministry or a minister is proposing something, additional compliance costs 50 million, he is required within the next year to make a similar proposal, but not with additional costs, but reducing costs by 50 million. And this covers the whole range of legislation with one important exemption, and that is the implementation of EU legislation. So if a directive is coming from Brussels, which is then transposed into national law, of course the parliament has no influence, they cannot change that, so the government, and therefore this is not counted in this system. And, but the system started July 1st last year. So we are now close to 1 year, and we can see that up to now it has worked. So we have more proposals reducing costs than increasing costs. And so the overall cost level, you remember the curve which I showed to you, has not further increased here. On the side here, obviously we are in a pretty stable development. So whether this is now a consequence of this wonderful one-in, one-out rule or not, I think that's a little bit too early, because it depends, of course, a little bit by accident, you know. Is there a proposal coming which is politically very controversial, very cost-intensive, like minimum wage, introduction of a minimum wage, or not? This is not coming every year, you know, on a yearly basis. So it's too early. We are waiting for another 2 years, and then we can see, is it working or is it not working, you know. But on the other hand, I think, personally, as a former civil servant, I think putting some discipline and some pressure on the ministries, you know, first to reflect and not to go forward with every wonderful idea which you might have seen in an election campaign and so on, you know. I think this is nevertheless quite helpful, you know. So there's a certain, I call it always, we have now pressure, we have transparency on costs, but we have also pressure in the system. So you cannot simply have every good idea is not automatically translated into a new law. You know, this is, I think, and I was personally, I can tell you that a little bit surprised that there was no more protest coming from ministers. You know, obviously, and it was indeed. I mean, we are not in a public meeting, so I can tell you, it was at the end the clear decision of the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor. So number one of the two coalition partners. The Committee of State Secretaries was not so enthusiastic, as you can imagine, you know. So it was a clear political decision from the top, okay, we are going and we are taking the risk to introduce more discipline and pressure into the system to keep the costs under control. So the point you can see from this, if the number one or the people who have really something to say in the country are not behind the system, it's getting very difficult. Yeah? So you need really, in a way, of course, also a political support to develop ideas like this and to get acceptance, because usually the ministries like to keep their freedom and not being, I think, too much constrained by wonderful rules like this. You know? Okay, so I think almost the last point, what I called already EU legislation. So the system we are applying nowadays is, as I said here, yes, here. The Commission is adopting a proposal, and usually the proposal is then accompanied by an impact assessment. So this impact assessment, of course, is not always, but in general, the idea is they are giving you some figures on the compliance costs. But of course, these figures refer to the European Union as a whole and not to every country. Okay, so we could not, therefore we have, sorry, that was the wrong one, yeah. We have invented here a threshold. We have said, okay, if the proposal of the Commission is going along with follow-up costs for the whole European Union, more than 35 million euros, then the federal government has the ministry in charge. He has to enter into a detailed analysis. What does this proposal mean to Germany? You see this here with the German federal. You see that here. The federal government impact assessment has to be done. The impact on Germany's business, citizens, and administration. So the threshold of 35 million is clear that we are not doing that for all the small proposals. I mean, that is too much work, not really relevant, you know. And you can, by the way, also see that 35 is a typical compromise, you know. The ministries wanted a threshold 50, and I said 20, and so then the compromise was 35, you know. That explains why it's, we ended up with this figure. Okay, so, and then I think the federal government is taking this analysis and presenting that in the working group of the European Council. That is the idea. And because, for example, what could happen is that they are analyzing a proposal and they are coming and say, okay, the follow-up costs for Germany alone are already, let's say, 50 million. And then you can compare that with the impact assessment of the Commission. And if the Commission says the whole impact is only for the European Union 100, we would say that that is not plausible. If it's for Germany already 50, it must be much more for the whole European Union than just 100. So if member states start analyzing that and presenting that in the Council working group, it's clear that you have a much better control of the work of the Commission. Up to now, nobody is doing that, and therefore the Commission can, I mean, I don't want to go too far, but they can present figures whatever they want, you know, and as long if there's nobody who can really check that against something serious, you know. And I think this is a type of discussion we need in Brussels, that member states, I think, are doing their homework, coming to Brussels and checking, is it plausible what the Commission is putting on the table or not? And I know what I'm talking about. When I was a young civil servant, when I started at the end of the 1970s, the time of oil crisis and so on, I was a German representative as civil servant in the Council working group on energy. So I have done that a couple of years, and although this is long ago, but the colleagues tell me nowadays it has not that much changed. The Commission, of course, has no interest that the member states are coming and really presenting figures, because then they have to defend their proposal. And therefore, but I think it must be the interest of member states to be better prepared, I think, for discussions like this. And I think looking on the interests of German business, German citizens and administration, we have to ask ourselves, what is the impact of a Commission's proposal, I think, to Germany? And this is then something we would like to discuss with the European Commission. And I think our citizens and businessmen can expect from the government that they have a clear-cut idea on the impact of a certain proposal in Brussels on their business in Germany, in this country. And I think this will not be different, I think, here in Italy. So also to show you two subjects which we are discussing, for which we have not yet found a good solution. The first one, I don't know whether it applies to Italy. As I said, we have legislation on a federal level, but then we have regions and communities who are implementing that usually. And if we are now preparing new legislation, we need information from the regions and from the local communities. How do you see the implementation costs to be expected, the administrative costs for this proposal? And in order to have a reasonable calculation and presenting that to Parliament, we need information from the regions and from the local communities. And as in Germany, everybody's independent, you know. You can imagine it's not so easy to get this information. So, because they're always afraid that when the federal government is asking, that they would lose part of their independence. And also it could be interesting if every one of our regions are saying, okay, these are the costs. Then you can compare the cost structure of the administrations in the different regions. And our regions, at least, are not interested in that. they love transparency, but not on their own situations, you know, to others. You know, they don't want to tell everybody how costly they are or not costly, you know. And that would be wonderful if you would have figures for all the different regions. Then we could tell the regions you are too expensive and you have to work on your costs, and others are the cost leaders. So you can imagine that the regions usually don't like that, and therefore it's not so easy to convince them to provide figures and on these costs to be expected to execute later on legislation. So we are in a pilot project, and we have working groups on this. We try at this time to convince them. The second point is maybe also very interesting to you, what I've called analysis of benefits. We are talking always on costs. But if you are in business, everybody is not doing just a cost analysis, you are doing a cost-benefit analysis. Because before taking a decision, usually you compare the costs and the benefit of something. So why are we not doing that in this case? If you look more in the methodology, you find out, and in experience of other countries, it is much easier to quantify costs than benefits. That is a simple reason for this. I give you an example. If you have a wonderful health policy and you say, okay, the objective is to increase the life expectancy of a certain group of people by 1 year. So now the interesting question is, what is the quantified value that you can live 1 year longer? What is the value of this 1 year? Is it 10,000 euros, 100,000 euros, 1 million euros? Nobody knows. The Anglo-Saxons, I mean the British and the Americans, are much more pragmatic. They say, it doesn't matter, we just take one figure, 100,000 euros, and then they start calculating. In Germany, there is, in Parliament, people would be very sensitive on this, to put figures on something like this. So this is the difficulty we are encountering. We have not yet found a solution for this, but we are running a number of pilot projects. The ministry, by the way, who is mostly interested in benefit calculation, quantifications, is, as you can imagine, the Ministry of the Environment. Because if you have legislation on the environment, it's always very expensive. You are usually asking, you need, let's say, reduce emissions or whatever in a factory, you know. Reduce emissions means, what is that, constructing a filter, you know, reporting systems and so on. You are causing costs. So therefore, the environment people, in our government system at least, they are very fond. They say, we are doing so wonderful things, you know, because we are reducing all these emissions and people can live longer and so on. And they do want to quantify that. So we are working, as I said, on pilot projects, but we are not yet at the point that we are including the quantification of benefits as a, let's say, regular case in our business. But we see, of course, the attractiveness of this, you know. And maybe when we continue our cooperation in the future, that we can work on these kind of open issues, you know, together. It's, I think, would be wonderful if in Europe, I think, across certain borders and several countries could really reflect on this together to come up with solutions, and probably you could have very good ideas on this, which would be interesting for us. So this is a little bit, I think, yeah, last point is internationally, we as a Normenkontrollrat, we have contacts with all these institutions, again, OECD and the European institutions, and we are working together with other countries who have similar committees. You can see here in the chart we have in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in the United Kingdom, and in the Czech Republic, and ourselves. So there have been up to now 5 countries. Finland and Norway just have joined us about a month ago. So we are now 7. And I've written here Italy, question mark, so hopefully you are the next one, and then we can also, yeah, because this is not just for fun, this is, if you come to Brussels, to Mr. Timmermans, the Vice President, and you say it's not just a German or an Italian idea, but this is the idea coming from 5, 6, or 7 countries. People are listening to you more carefully. And that is the idea of this international. Also to have an exchange between the countries, to say, okay, what is your experience, my experience, can I learn from you, or do you have answers to questions which we have found in our system? So we are meeting 2 or 3 times a year, and this has been, I think, very useful. So, yeah, that was all. Probably we have already 4 o'clock, so sorry for having been so long, but the idea, I hope that I was able to get a few ideas across to you, how we are working and what we want to achieve, and I'm looking forward, if there's still time enough, I think, to questions from you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
I cannot have been so good that you have no questions anymore.
No. Riccardo Ercoli, Nicol, un attimo. Sì. Okay. The first one, Riccardo Ercoli.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. I would like to ask you if you can give us more details on the background of the staff of the Secretariat working in your organization. Thanks.
Okay, the second one, Nicolò De Salvo.
In the last years, Italian Statistical Institute has tried to provide also quality of life statistics along the traditional GDP calculation, facing various difficulties. NKR is also taking into account the broader effects, for example, in the environmental field, and the cost-benefits perspective when evaluating the new legislation acts. Do you think that in the near future, concrete results are achievable?
Michele Magrini.
NKR currently, in according to your analysis, NKR currently operates at the heart of a federal government inside the German chancellery. Do you think, Mr. Ludewig, this institutional position is the best one, or do you think it would be better in the future a more independent structure, for example, similar to regulation authorities of public services? Thank you.
Fortunato Lambiase.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I'm here. I have a question about the sort of political aspect concerning your institution, and it is that if you think that political authorities in the last years has appreciated the work done by this institution that is now completing the second term, as I understood, and if you feel that in the future there's the opportunity to guarantee also in the future this work, and probably also to strengthen its role and importance in your country. Thank you.
Giancarlo Salone.
First of all, thank you for your interesting presentation. I would like to put a question about as to the exchange with the European Commission. You explained very clearly that while the cost analysis is more or less advanced as to the methodologies, etc., the benefit side of the analysis is still in progress. But when you examine or you put under a scrutiny proposals coming from Brussels, do you have also a sort of analysis or an examination regarding the benefit aspects, since generally proposals coming from the European Commission stress a lot about the expected benefits?
E l'ultimo, Andrea Carboni.
EU institutions are currently trying to introduce a more effective impact analysis in order to avoid unnecessary additional bureaucratic burden and costs related to new legislation. Do you think this kind of check should be organized in a form of cooperation between EU and national regulatory bodies, building a horizontal network similar to competition authorities structure?
the first question on the background of our staff, it's relatively simple. As I said, we have 15 people, 2 secretaries and 13 academics. And we are recruiting them usually by, let's say, for a certain time period, let's say 3 to 4 years, from the ministries. So there's a system, electronic platform, where these jobs, I think, are announced, and then people can send applications, and then we have the choice, I think, who is the best qualified. That is the idea. So usually we try to have a spread of qualifications in our staff. So you need people with a law background, you need economists, you need whatever, also one who is very competent on electronic questions, and e-government and these. So you need a certain range of expertise, and that's the way we try to compose that. So as I said, 13 academics, and then, as I said, we have 10 members in the Normenkontrollrat, and we have this rapporteur system. So we have the rapporteur, member of the NKR, and he is usually working with one person in the secretariat, a staff member whose background fits exactly with the ministry I think they are looking into. So that is the way we are working. But what I'm always saying is, we are not an administration where you can wait for retirement. So everybody coming is working for a limited period of time. It can, let's say, between 2 and it can also in some cases be 6 years at the end, but certainly not longer than that. Because otherwise the know-how, the experience, the background is then outdated. So we need people who have really practical experience in producing legislation and preparing legislation. So that is the idea. Next question, whether cost-benefit, whether there's something for the near future. As I said, the Anglo-Saxons are doing that. If you look impact assessments from the United Kingdom, they are doing that, of course, as far as possible. So, and probably what you see in these impact assessments is that the cost side is 100% quantified, and on the benefit side, usually they are coming up with figures for part of the benefit. Usually it's very difficult to quantify 100%. Can you give you an example? We have also launched a study. We have asked an institute in Germany to put together facts and evidence from various countries. And there was, I remember that one example from the United States, and that was a law imposing or introducing, I think, a free access to handicapped people, to public institutions. Okay, it was easy to calculate the cost because you know the buildings and you know average cost, construction cost to provide that. That was easy to do. So what is now the benefit side? The benefit, and the Americans, they split the benefit. One part of the benefit is that handicapped people could get faster to the service, I think they wanted to have from the public side. And they did some time and then certain minutes, and then the value of one hour was, I don't know what, $10 or whatever. So there was a figure at the end. The other part could not be quantified, and that is, what is the benefit, let's say, the increase in self-confidence of the handicapped people? Because if you do not have to ask anybody to help you and to get there, you can do it on your own. It is clear that this has a very positive impact on how you are feeling and on your self-confidence. You can enter as people who are not handicapped, every public, whatever, office or whatever, And so the Americans, I think, did an interesting, at the end, calculation. They had the cost, let's say it's 100, and on the benefit side, as I said, the gain in time was, let's say, 70. So there was still a difference, a negative difference of 30. But they said, okay, the gain in self-confidence, I cannot quantify that. But it's clear that this is much more than the remaining cost, I think, difference against it. So that is a practical example what you can do. So, as I said, usually you cannot quantify the whole benefit. And this is something, as I said, we are running certain pilot projects in Germany. I've asked certain ministries to present certain cases. And so I think probably in a year from now, we will have a better feeling to what extent and how fast we can introduce something like this. Whether we can do it as the Anglo-Saxons are doing that, or whether we need more time. Because I think in principle it's very important, because you, or not you, but those as far as you are senators or legislator, it's clear that the benefit is an important point. You cannot leave them aside. Yeah? So, third question was our independent status. Maybe I was not clear enough. I think what is correct. Our office is in the Chancellery, but we are not part of the Chancellery. We are not part of the hierarchy. We are independent. I do not have to ask anybody in the Chancellery whether I want to do this or I want to do that. Whether we, I think, are giving a press release or whether we are giving an opinion, whether I write a letter to the Chancellor or to another minister to criticize or not to criticize. So it's just an organizational question. We as a committee are completely independent within these 5 years. Within these 5 years, the government cannot ask anybody to withdraw or to disappear. Yeah? He has a mandate for 5 years. And this is the independence, and this is... I think has worked up to now quite. Having our offices in the Chancellery was just a nice gesture to show, okay, this is something important, but had nothing to do that we are part of the, let's say, hierarchy there. Yeah? I don't know whether they're always happy about this, but that is at least the way it works up to now. Our role in the future is easy because, I mean, to describe, because we are doing our work on the basis of a law, the so-called NKR law. And so the government cannot change us. So the government would need to go to Parliament if they want to change, I think, the framework of what we are doing. And this is, of course, more complicated. I'm not so sure whether if the government can decide alone. We see our Dutch colleagues. Our Dutch colleagues are doing their work not on the basis of a law adopted by Parliament, but on the basis of a decision of the government. And the government can change their decision every day. They can say you are crazy, or your work is not really what we expect, or whatever, you know. And there have been several changes within 1 or 2 years, you know, in the Dutch system. And this is not possible in the German system. So we are grateful to government and parliament. They, before knowing anything what we would do, you know, that they organize everything on the basis of a law. That gives us a lot of freedom and stability. And so I'm quite confident that whoever the people will be, but the NKR will continue. I think there's no time limit in the law. So in principle, it will go on forever, you know. Certainly not forever, but I think certainly for still quite a number of years. The benefit for Brussels. I think Brussels is not so easy to describe. You might have heard about the so-called Stoiber group, which existed in Brussels. This was a group, Stoiber, former Prime Minister of Bavaria, who was asked by Mr. Barroso to run a commission and to analyze a little bit what the commission is doing there. And I was a member in that group, and one of the conclusions was that the so-called Impact Assessment Board, which is now called Regulatory Scrutiny Board, that this board should be more independent. And the problem was this Impact Assessment Board, which is comparable to what we are doing, was composed of commissioned civil servants. I mean, this is, in my view, not really, you cannot believe that commissioned civil servants are so independent that they are telling Mr. Barroso what your proposal is not really a good idea. So that is, I think, would be to expect too much. So, and Mr. Timmermans, the new commission, has partly accepted these proposals. Now the Impact Assessment Board or Regulatory Scrutiny Board has 6 members, and 3 are appointed from outside. But the other 3 and the chairman are still commissioned civil servants. So in my view, they still have a way. You need some courage, I think. I'm always telling the people also in the German government, if you believe in the quality of your work, why are you afraid of an independent commission? Yeah? But the commission, in my view, is still afraid because they see, we don't know what these independent people might say, so we better keep that somehow under control. And for example, it is still not clear in Brussels for which proposals the Commission is also producing an impact assessment. There is not an impact assessment for every proposal. And the criteria, why is there now an impact or not, have never been published. And this, of course, is something which is not creating confidence in the system. I have always personally the impression that they still want to keep an option open, I think, to do even if to go forward with certain projects, even if the vote of the independent group might be negative. So this is, but that is my personal interpretation. Whether so, the Commission still has a certain way to go, and we had a meeting with Mr. Timmermans. These group of 5 independent bodies. We will have another short meeting in a few weeks, and Mr. Timmermans himself is very open, a very competent personality. But he has told us, I mean, as I said, we are not here without any public. He has said that the whole administration below him, they are certainly against everything like this. And so he has a lot to do if he wants to introduce something to overcome resistance coming from the existing administration. Because the existing administration is, of course, afraid having independent people means they have to justify. They have to justify their work, the quality, against somebody who is looking into all this before it can be sent to the Commission to take decisions. And this is obviously not something some people in Brussels in the administration are looking forward to. So this is my interpretation. So I hope I have not forgotten something. But as I said, looking backward, I think one can say that I have to say the German government and the German parliament were very courageous because they did not know how this group would work. And they simply jumped into the cold water. And they did it. And I think in having such an independent body within the government system, being independent but nevertheless being part of the preparatory process for legislation, is something positive, because you have somebody who is asking critical questions sometimes. And this is always helpful for yourself as a government to reassure yourself whether your idea you are pursuing really is a good idea or whether the preparatory work has sufficient quality. So I think this is positive, and so the overall experience, I think, and the fact that more countries are now introducing bodies like this is maybe also something giving encouragement.
Mr. President, once again, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.